Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this live chat we're going to do on, well, basically it's 5 years after Paris. This coming Saturday, the 12th of December, it is exactly 5 years ago that the Paris Agreement was concluded and celebrated. And a lot of things happened in those 5 years, but also a lot of things didn't happen in those 5 years. So we're probably going to discuss that. But we will be focusing in this live chat on the developments in the United States. And of course, the most interesting development there was on the 3rd of November, by now already more than a month ago, where Joe Biden was elected as the new president. I think we all agree with that now. There is still some resistance in some corners of the world, still not accepting the win of Joe Biden. But I think the civilized majority in this world does know that president-elect is Joe Biden. We are going to discuss today, what will that mean for the world? What does that mean for Paris? What does it mean for climate change policies? And, well, who else is better suited to do that, to discuss that with, than I can have here. And I'm very thrilled to have you here, Keya Chatterjee. Good morning for you, live from Washington, D.C. It's great you're here. Keya is the Executive Director of Climate Action Network in the US, and of course very closely involved in all the climate policies, well, that were in there the last 4 years basically, but also of course after these elections to talk about the expectations for the coming period in time, what to expect from the United States. So Keya, good to have you, and well, as said, good morning for you.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're very much welcome. And if you have questions, please put them online. We will have, of course, a conversation and we'll pick up questions that are coming in between. So feel free to drop your questions if you want, if you have any. Maybe just to start off, Keya, and let's not do that for a very long while. But still, we have to, of course, look back into the last 4 years where we had a President, Donald Trump, who, of course, made a lot of impact in the world by stepping out of the Paris Agreement. But I think, well, it's important to realize he did much more than just only stepping out of the Paris Agreement. So maybe, and I know you don't want to dwell too long about this, but I do think it's good for all the viewers to get a bit of a feeling on what happened in the United States on the front of climate change policies under President Donald Trump.
Yeah, it was really a wholesale gutting of all of our environmental regulations that touch on climate and that touch on public health and safety. So it's hard to, I mean, literally hundreds of rules. So making the air more polluted, not wanting to deal with coal ash, slowing down dealing with mercury in the air, allowing drilling. There's a last minute rush, of course, right now to suddenly open up drilling, approving pipelines for tar sands, rolling back protections for wildlife, allowing lead pipes, which we know is a really dangerous neurotoxin and people's brains. Really, the list goes on and on and on. But they rolled back everything they could. Not all of it stood up in the courts. In fact, a lot of it did not stand up in the courts, but they really gutted civil society as well and the ability to quickly undo all of this. And they're still trying to do that as sort of their last act running out the door. They're just, setting everything on fire, metaphorically, that they can after their actions literally set a huge chunk of the country on fire over the last 4 years.
Thanks a lot. I hope it's sometimes there was a bit of a disturbance on my line. So, but I hear it was better for all the others. So apologies if I didn't get 100% there. But so maybe just to cut it short, these 4 years, right? Because I think it's a time that everyone would like to forget. Maybe it is interesting to hear then on President-elect Joe Biden. Of course, I think a lot of people were very enthusiastic, certainly on the European side, because the feeling is, the United States will get back on board again. How serious do we have to take this pledge of Joe Biden? Because of course he is still the same person that was also vice president under Barack Obama. It's maybe not the new generation that you could expect on climate policy either. So maybe it is good to see on how you do see the campaign towards the 3rd of November while getting Joe Biden into climate change policies, and also how the movement is now expecting what's going to change under his leadership.
Yeah, so the climate movement really pushed very hard in this election cycle. And what we saw as a result is that Biden and Harris ran on a platform that was pretty unprecedented on climate justice, on racial justice, on economic justice, and marrying those issues together with a robust COVID response. And so, it is absolutely what they ran on. It is why we voted for them. It's why the American public voted for them. And it is our expectation that they now implement those things. Now, there will be a lot of efforts to walk back from commitments that were made during the election, I fear, but we are simply not going to allow that walking back to happen. There's just too many lives at stake. We have a situation in this country where people are waiting for miles in line for food, where we have another spike of COVID. People are really hurting. There's been no relief. And we've been pushing very hard that this relief must come in a way that protects people, that's friendly to the climate, that advances racial justice, where we have 40% of the funds going towards Black, Indigenous, brown frontline communities, because that is what it's going to take to move this country forward. And so we are right now calling on Biden and Harris to be brave, to be bold, and to stand up for all of the issues that they ran on in this election and that we voted for.
Mm-hmm. Could you just you say it's clear we voted for him. It's the platform that enabled all this. He got quite some votes on it. Climate change seemed to be really a topic on the agenda on this election campaign. Of course, it did not get so much attention because it's most mainly about Corona, COVID-19. But clearly, climate was an issue for many voters. But you also said, there might be some rowing back on some of the promises. And what kind of discussion is taking place there now? On what kind of topics do you feel you need to keep up the pressure, basically?
Well, right now we're in a moment where personnel decisions are being made. And so we there's a saying in the US, I actually don't know who said it first, that personnel is policy. The people you put into positions really dictates a lot of your policy. And so that is one thing we've been keeping a very close eye on. Can we make sure that people who do not have ties to the fossil fuel industry are put into the positions where they'll have a lot of influence over climate and energy policy. I think also, when you're as soon in this country, there's just this unfortunate common sense around austerity that we really need to push back on in this moment, because people are really hurting. And honestly, even if we get climate policies, but we spend 4 years not helping the people of this country, where we have massive income inequality, even though it's a very wealthy country, that wealth is in the hands of very, very few people. And if we don't help those people, we're going to end up with another Trump or someone like Trump, because all of these decades of neoliberal policy have made it so that people are really struggling. And when people are really struggling to this extent, then fascists and demagogues become appealing. And it's not just happening in this country, it's happening around the world. And so the fear of austerity, I think, is one of the biggest fears we have, that we won't be willing to invest what we need to invest to really bring about a transformation of this country and a Green New Deal.
I think quite some of those challenges, to be very honest, we have on this side of the Atlantic as well. If you look at the Green Deal that Europe has published, is of course on paper also a sincere attempt to have a new economy. But for that, of course, we will have to put aside some of the neoliberal policies that we also had on this side. It's probably less polarized as in the United States, but I think we have comparable challenges there. Talking about the polarization there, of course, there is also a bit of a question: what can Joe Biden do in domestic policies when he does not get a majority in the Senate? We all know, because Europeans follow the US elections and everything afterwards in great detail, so we all know that there are still 2 runoff elections for the Senate in Georgia, determining whether the Democrats or the Republicans will have the majority in the Senate. Let's start negative. What if the Republicans maintain their majority in the Senate? To what extent will that hamper Joe Biden's possibilities of getting climate policies off the ground?
Well, I think there's obviously a lot that the president can do, as we saw with the last 4 years of the Trump administration. So there are certainly executive actions. There are existing laws where regulations can be promulgated. There are decisions the president can make. But I think the hardest part here is that it's Congress that spends money. And at the end of the day, without spending money, it's going to be very hard to deal with the suffering that people are currently experiencing. Hundreds of thousands of people dead, as I said. And on top of that, we had a year in the United States where we had a record number of hurricanes. Communities like Lake Charles in Louisiana hit over and over again. Communities in California, in Oregon, in Washington, all over the West, really badly affected by air quality. People whose not only their homes were burnt down and turned to ashes, their entire communities were turned to ashes. And that level of suffering requires some money and some investment. And we need that investment to go into the communities that have purposefully been made vulnerable through racist policy that kind of originated in colonialism. And all of that hurt, dealing with that is very, very hard without the Senate. It's not impossible, but it means that we need to keep organizing in this country. And it also means that we really need to rely on the president to do some of that organizing. The president has a very, very big microphone, and we need to start moving people along and helping people understand how much people are hurting and how much we could move them. And I don't think we should give up on moving things just because we don't have every vote we want. We need to actually make it really impossible for people to take wrong votes. And that is partly something that the president needs to do, and it's partly something that we as civil society need to do as well. Make it really, really hard to take bad votes, regardless of which party you're in. Of course, we have this just total difference of reality between one party and the other party. We have siloed information. We have a party that's become really, almost cultish in their willingness to accept misinformation. And I don't know how much of this comes across in Europe, but like we literally here in Washington, D.C., where I live, we had a gunman walk into a pizza restaurant because he was convinced online that that one of our politicians, John Podesta, was running a child pedophilia ring in the basement. Well, this is a family pizza restaurant with no basement. So that's what you're dealing with here is like a good third of a country who has been somewhat brainwashed, and we actually need to do the organizing to bring them back into our society and talk to people and understand what's going on and move them along. Because I think at the end of the day, a grass top strategy is not going to work entirely unless we also take into account that we need a grassroots strategy and to talk to people.
Now, of course, I see your point, and I agree, of course, and absolutely, as you said, the president has a big microphone for that. We've seen that certainly the last couple of years, but at the same time, we also just need changes in policies, right? And for that, you need the votes in the Senate. What kind of policies can Joe Biden do change? Even with a resisting Senate, and taking your point that there needs to be a new dialogue with our entire society, but at the same time, of course, there is still this very polarized political debate in Washington, D.C., what is not necessarily representative for what you see in the United States population, but it is there in D.C. and it can still hold back. So what can Biden do even without the Senate?
A whole lot. And so there's a lot of executive actions that can be done. And there's also an unleashing of the states that can be done from the executive. And so we saw in the Trump administration an effort to curb the ability of California and other states, for example, to regulate emissions. That can be undone at the federal level. There's so many regulations that can be done across sectors, whether you're talking about transportation or the electricity sector or agriculture. There's a whole lot that can be done from the executive. I think that that's really important, and we must really apply a lot of pressure to do those, to advance climate justice, racial justice, economic justice. But I think from an international perspective, it is notable that it's very hard to spend money and get climate finance, for example, without the Senate. And that's where we have this sort of long-term education process that is needed, because we depending on what happens, and we are far from giving up on Georgia, just to be clear. Like these are for sure winnable elections. Obviously, there's you never know, but we are not giving up on Georgia for sure. And we also have in Georgia a public service commission election as well as the two Senate elections, and that will decide a lot of the energy future for Georgia. So there's a lot of important elections happening in the state of Georgia. Also happening in a few other places where we have runoffs, not quite at the level of international attention of Georgia. But I think that, like, yes, there's a lot that can be done at the executive level. I think we should also be really aware that what can be done by an executive can be undone by a subsequent executive, which is why we have to keep doing all of that organizing in the country. For me, the answer to having a country that we need to bring along with us is not to compromise until we do nothing, which we've seen in the past as being an approach, frankly, of even the Obama administration. I don't think that that's the right approach. I think the right approach is to actually fight for policies that will help people tangibly on the ground and implement those policies, because those will speak for themselves, because people's lives will be tangibly better. And that's what we need to fight for every day of this administration, policies that will tangibly help people in their day-to-day lives.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's well, and logically, you're not giving up on Georgia, because it's, as far as we see, it is going to be a 50-50 battle there. So anything can go, anything can happen there in Georgia still. So I was also not asking you to give up on that part. That's for sure. Maybe now go to the international level, because that's the new setting. Joe Biden, president-elect. he has a lot of opportunities domestically, certainly through regulation. There is, of course, the challenge of budget, which really hangs on the Senate. But as you said, this also is a longer term agenda where we need to convince also the broader audience how necessary an investment program is, no matter what, basically. But if we have it, then let's do it in the right and just way, socially just way. Internationally, Joe Biden has promised that one of his first action will be to get back into the Paris Accord. So I think, well, I only welcome that, and probably the audience also listening in on this chat. And he also promised that he wants to have the United States being climate neutral by 2050 as well, which is, of course, something that in Europe we also pledged, and we see now more and more countries doing that. We also know next year is going to be a very important year for the international climate negotiations. The climate summit of this year has been postponed with 1 year because of COVID-19. It will take place in Glasgow by the end of next year. And that really should be the year of an increased climate ambition. To what extent do you think that Joe Biden, or for that matter, John Kerry, who is the climate envoy, is seeing that importance of Glasgow next year and is now starting to work on that global momentum that we need to create next year?
Yeah, I think with the appointment of John Kerry, you can expect a lot of focus on that, because you have somebody who really has a lot of personal relationships and who has a lot of history in the climate negotiations. And so they're absolutely paying attention to that. Absolutely, it is a point of focus. I do think that for us in civil society, there's a lingering concern about, how much of this attention. We saw the appointment of Secretary Kerry, who obviously is a very well-known figure, knows the issue deeply, cares a lot about the issue, but also appointing Kerry to the National Security Council. And so a concern that we don't slip into a view of climate change as a militaristic issue when we already have way too much militarism coming from the United States. Is there a way that we can make sure that that's not the frame in which we're thinking about the climate crisis, but rather we're seeing it as a social justice crisis that came about because of racial injustice, because of economic injustice? In the United States, I often say that I don't know we would have a climate crisis if it were not for racism and colonialism. I don't know that they would have found places to build coal-fired power plants. I know that they don't want them and wouldn't have built them in rich white communities. So where would they have put them? Maybe back when Jimmy Carter was president and wanted to move to solar, we would have done that because we wouldn't have been so willing to sacrifice Black and Indigenous and brown communities in this country, which is what ultimately caused the climate crisis. And so that lens is one that I'm concerned about lacking. I'm quite confident that there will be a huge focus on Glasgow and the COP and advancing the United States participation there.
But what's your concern? I very much get your that this should be about social justice and not about a security agenda. But what's your concern that if that angle is pursued by Joe Biden and John Kerry, what will that lead to?
It could just lead to us seeing this as a problem for the military to solve, as opposed to a society-wide problem that we have in this country and around the world that really requires us to invest deeply in racial justice and liberation and decolonialism, and those that frame is very different from we have a military security crisis on our hands, and the way you respond could be very different. We don't want to be moving towards sort of an eco-fascist approach to this issue, and you saw this even just recently from the Trumps. You saw Ivanka Trump saying, "Oh, emissions are down in the United States this year." It's like, emissions are down because you failed to deal with a global pandemic 250,000 plus people are dead. That is not how we deal with emissions. You deal with emissions by a Green New Deal, by investments in community, investments in renewable energy, investments in public transportation, investments in trains, investments in regenerative agriculture. And so we just want to make sure the frame stays on that we are doing this for people. This is not like this is not a situation that we want viewed through a militaristic frame. And part of the reason for that is that we think that the problem that we've had in this country is really this alignment of white nationalists and warmongering imperialists and fossil fuel oligarchs who are totally aligned with people who want nobody except, white heterosexual men to have power. And that alignment has been very, very hard to overcome. And it's time for us to turn that around and view a just and equitable country and world, and that will change the role of the U.S. within the world. I hope to one where we are trying to be a good neighbor instead of always trying to view everything in the world as some kind of military situation.
If I hear you like this, Keya, and the way you are linking the different issues, and also how you're describing how, that's probably how you can summarize it, the swamp in DC, right, that got so connected and led to the problems we are having. To be very honest, if I then think of Joe Biden, it doesn't sound to me like someone who is looking at the issue in this fundamental way, because this really desires a huge shift, a total shift in policy making, how America has been done. I don't see that right away from Joe Biden. So do you share that concern, and how do you think that can change? Because we now have 4 years of a chance, but you also know, as you said, if we don't do it right, there will be a new Trump or the same Trump, we don't know, in 4 years' time. So, but does Joe Biden see this fundamental challenging agenda?
I think that we brought Joe Biden a long way in this cycle, and there was a lot of movement that was made. For example, in the United States, like in Joe Biden's platform, it explicitly says that 40% of investment will go to Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. There's quite a few very good statements in the platform, which he had to make in order to win. And so I think that our job now is to have some accountability around that. That again, we voted for climate justice, racial justice, economic justice, and that to be dealt with as we come out of this COVID crisis and to bring us out of this crisis. That's what we voted for, and we did move Biden during the election, which shows me that he can be moved. And that's how he got a lot of votes. If you look at the first-time voters between 18 and 44, their number one issue was climate. That was their reason that they finally came voted after maybe not having voted previously. And so that is, that is part of the story of how he was elected. And this is a person we believe we can work with and that we can move and that we can hold accountable. We did not think that with Trump. That was a fascist who was, who had autocratic tendencies. We now have a person we think we can push and move and educate. And it is not going to be easy. I use a lot of Star Wars metaphors here. I don't know how they translate, but the thing everyone's very excited about having a new administration. And indeed, we should be excited. But what we have right now is the plans to the Death Star. We have not blown up the first Death Star, much less the second Death Star that gets rebuilt. We have a lot of work ahead in this country. We didn't just overnight become this just and equitable place that is a good neighbor to the rest of the world, but that is certainly what we are fighting for.
I think the Star Wars analogy is working, even for those who don't know Star Wars. I think people get the picture there. That's of course true, right? But at the same time, you also have the feeling that there is a kind of a narrative out there that Joe Biden won the election thanks to restoring the blue wall, being Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Where, of course, as soon as for example, it was about shale gas. As soon as he was in Pennsylvania, Joe Biden was a bit evasive on that topic. I think Trump also made the joke that the position of Joe Biden on shale gas depends in which state he is, which of course already gives a bit of a concern on how is he going to push that kind of energy agenda where he feels that he owns something to those states where, of course, that industry is still very prominent.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, what we've seen in the United States in terms of our energy infrastructure is that coal has been declining quite steadily, even during the Trump administration. We've seen a real decline in coal, and that's pretty much stayed on track. What we unfortunately have seen is a lot of cheap gas. And a lot of that coal being replaced by gas instead of by renewables. And so that is just like technologically a challenge for us that we need to figure out. I think that moving to electrifying everything, making sure that we are, because we're cleaning up the grid, and have quite a few states that have 100% renewable electricity targets. I think that there's a lot of ways forward to move out of gas entirely in this country. I think it was a big mistake, honestly, to say that there was any support for fracked gas, because the people of Pennsylvania actually opposed fracking. Those are the votes he was trying to win. And unfortunately, this is where you see the effect of the presidential microphone. When Biden said, "Oh, actually, I don't support a ban," support decreased for a ban. So the act of saying it, people thought, "Oh, well, I'm on his team, so what he's saying must be what I'm supposed to be thinking." And you see that effect happening. And so we have to stop that, because we don't have time for this. As you know, we are in the middle of a climate crisis. We don't have time to be continuing to build another kind of fossil fuel when we all know the effects of leaking methane on the atmosphere. It results in people's communities being turned to ashes, more large wildfires, more hurricanes, more mosquitoes, more rats, more disease. And so we don't have time for it. It was a unfortunate statement that was made. I would say on the plus side, there's a lot of momentum to clean up the electricity sector and move it all to renewable electricity anyway. So, and there's a lot of momentum at the state level to ban extraction of fracking, and certainly at the community level in a lot of these places. But we have our work cut out for us on the extraction end in this country. The United States is an exporter of energy, and regardless of what we do domestically, we are going to be causing climate change around the world if we don't stop that. And that's a huge challenge for us as civil society. When you look at the predictions of how much of the new production in the world is coming online, too much of that is from the United States. So we have a lot of organizing to do, a lot of work to do. That said, Biden also had a good platform on stopping fossil fuel extraction in the administration. Apart from that one issue, there's a lot of efforts that will immediately get underway to stop extraction of fossil fuels from public lands, and using the tools of the executive branch.
Okay, so maybe then move a bit to the concrete plans to be expected, right? In January, Joe Biden will be inaugurated. He will quite quickly announce that the United States will step back into the Paris Agreement. And then also the United States needs to deliver their national climate plan as part of their promise of being part of the Paris Agreement, the national determined contribution in the UN terminology. What do you expect will be in that NDC, in that national determined contribution, and what do you want to see? And ideally, of course, it's the same, but that might not be 100% match. So maybe what you think is necessary to have that in that national action plan that Joe Biden needs to announce, and what you think will be in.
Yeah. So what I think will be in there is what was put forward during the election. So if you look at Biden's platform, what you'll see is a whole series of things that were put forward. Now, we will obviously need to have, and we have folks who really understand the process. So obviously there will have to be an economy-wide target in there. There will have to be, all of the elements of an NDC present there. But I would expect to see an NDC that's consistent with what was in in Biden's platform while he was running for office. And so all those numbers are there. I think what we would like to see is a clear statement on stopping all fossil fuel production and subsidies. Obviously, a lot of the transition to renewables language is there. A drastic cut in domestic emissions, which is there. And of course, we would like to see, a huge enhancement in support for vulnerable countries. And that is where, we need this administration to take on that role of educating the public about why we need to do this, that, our responsibility goes above and beyond our domestic emissions reductions, because of the role we have played in the world, because of our responsibility, because of our capabilities. We must do that, and it is in our interest to be a good neighbor in the rest of the world. And so there will be a statement on finance, would be my prediction. I think that there is a lot of work that we need to do in this country, and that this administration needs to do in this country, to educate the public about why we must be a good neighbor and enable a Green New Deal, not only here but also in the rest of the world.
Yeah. So that's clear. So on finance, but certainly the role of the US in the rest of the world. On the energy, the energy transition is ongoing. And as you said, the phase out of coal was even going on under Trump. It would be interesting if there will be some statement of the end of fossil fuels. That's exactly what we're also fighting for at the European side. And to be very honest, we're not there yet. We are now indeed also having coal phase out as a debate in each EU country. But a real clear phase out of fossils is not in the cards yet. But the debate is shifting. So let's see what happens there in the United States. Another big sector, of course, in the United States is transport, where you could say that reductions in emissions have not taken place that much, to put it mildly. What kind of policies are to be expected there? Because we've heard very recently for California, for example, that they are going to push for a phase out of the combustion engine, the internal combustion engine, by 2035. Which, of course, would be a tremendous step if a state like California is doing that. But what can the federal government do in order to also really get the reductions in the transport sector, which is huge in the United States?
Yeah, it is huge. And in fact, it's now larger than the electricity sector. And very relatively few inroads have been made compared to the electricity sector. So you're right to point it out. I think that the move to phase out the internal combustion engine is going to be a push at the federal level as well. We certainly, the executive branch has the ability through the Clean Air Act to do work around cleaner cars, and that has been part of Biden's platform. I will say that we also need to be making investments in something that Biden loves very much, which is rail. We have a real crumbling rail infrastructure here. We know that President Biden is a huge advocate for rail, has consistently ridden the train to work. And so we would be looking for some really big moves there. And then I'll say, a lot of our transportation problems are at the local level in the United States, caused by the federal level. And so what you see is huge. There's actually a requirement that 80% of funds get spent on highways and only 20% get spent on public transportation. And that is absurd, obviously, in the middle of a climate crisis. And the reason that it was put in place was actually to ensure that at least 20% be spent on public transportation initially years ago. Obviously, that is a really huge imbalance, and the amount of car culture we have in this country needs to be turned around. And so yes, clean cars. Yes, there will be a big push on that in transportation. We will also be pushing very strongly to make sure that the federal government doesn't make it so hard for communities to invest in public transportation. What we're seeing right now is, because of COVID, transportation ridership is down, and people in this country just seem to think that these should operate like private companies and make a profit, and we are not seeing them being bailed out. So whether it's the Washington, D.C. metro system or the New York City subway system or or any city in America that has public transportation, those are under massive threat right now because they've been really defunded for 4 years, and then we have this crisis of mismanagement around COVID that has resulted in some of the worst case rates in the world, which means that people are not riding transit. And so we are actually coming out of a massive crisis when it comes to transportation in this country. And we are at risk of seeing huge layoffs of bus drivers, huge, massive cuts to buses, to trains at a time when we need to be ramping them up. And so I think the focus on cars makes sense, and I certainly support it, given how many people get around with cars in this country. But it is not the whole picture, and there needs to be a whole lot of attention and pressure on public transportation and on bicycling and walking and having communities that are really intertwined. And this gets back to my issue about how we need to know each other and talk to each other. Part of car culture results in isolated people who are not interacting with other human beings. And that is really part of what brought us to the brink of fascism in this country, is that we had that culture. And so part of what we need to do is create community again. And that means we need to be able to see each other and say hello as neighbors, be able to walk down the street without being run over by a car. And that is not the country we have right now, sadly. Right now, if you go out for a walk, you very well might be run over by a driver. And so that balance needs to come back to this country, which honestly hasn't been here for a long time in terms of overinvestment in cars and car infrastructure.
Oh yeah, no, I do recognize it. And sometimes we Europeans have the tendency to copy the bad things from the US. So I mean, this entire drive-through culture, where I think anything you can do now in the United States, right? You can be in a drive-in, drive-through, or whatever. You see that now sometimes being copied at the European side, and I absolutely agree with you. I mean, it's what I like about the European cities compared to the American cities for the moment is indeed it's far less of a car culture than what you see in the United States. So maybe just to pick up, so we go into Glasgow next year. It's clear we can expect more American leadership again. Now it's a bit of a low bar to be better than the last 4 years, but okay, it will be much better than the last 4 years. What for your movement is a bit the benchmark when Glasgow is going to be a success? I mean, we are all piling up expectations for that big climate summit next year in Glasgow. What for you is the benchmark? When are you going to say, yeah, this has been a success, and what kind of ingredients do we need in the run-up to get that success in Glasgow?
Yeah, I mean, our bar for success is most definitely not being better than what we had. We know that what we had was impossibly dangerous. Our bar for success is, does this meet what the science demands in order to prevent as much suffering as we can in this moment? And so this is a moral issue. And so that is why we need to see these timetables sped up, which is why we have seen them up. In election cycle, we see stronger commitments than we saw when Biden was vice president. But we need to see those sped up even further because the bar here is preventing suffering, not whatever a quasi-fascist former administration was doing. Being better than that is expected, and is not really something that obviously it's going to be better, but that's not really what's needed right now, and that's why we have been pushing for a Green New Deal in this country and saying, look, we really only have a decade to make a massive transformation of this country. And that is a project that takes a government-wide commitment. And that is a project that can really help us get out of the economic crisis that we are in because of the terrible handling of COVID-19. And so we really see that these issues have to be dealt with together, and expect that we will meet the demands of what is required to prevent suffering, rather than a bar of what is better than what came before.
Right, and how will that? Because this you can expect the United States, probably there will be a program around a Green Deal. Let's see what that really means, of course, but probably terminology will certainly be used, as you see on the European side. Um, um, Hopefully this week at the European side, we will have a political agreement for an increased climate ambition for 2030. That's being debated this week, and the heads of state will come together by the end of this week, and we all hope that they will agree to move it further. So and then you will see next year Europe also putting that into law, right? So climate action, there will be probably 2021 for the European side will be a huge climate agenda. We also expect that at the US side at least, because that needs to then also to be delivered by Joe Biden. But of course, how will the relations? I know I'm asking a bit of a far stretch here, but just being interested on how you see that the relation of the United States and the European Union, for that matter, but with China, with India, with other big players who also need to step up their responsibilities. Russia. So how do you think that the new administration will work on that climate diplomacy in order to make Glasgow more than just a better success than it has been?
Yeah, I mean, I would anticipate that the administration stepping up quite a bit on this. And again, this gets back to the personnel as policy issue. John Kerry has, in the lead up to Paris, spent a lot of personal political capital talking to countries around the world. Now, again, some of it I would say is with less of a frame of, we need to decolonialize the world and we need to make sure that we are being supportive of the rest of the world and good neighbors. But I think that it is a huge commitment that will be made, and I anticipate that it will be a top diplomatic issue for the United States, and that's partly to the credit of other countries, where we know consistently other country leaders raise the issue of the climate crisis every time that they speak to the United States, and I think that will need to continue. To be honest, the United States needs to be pushed, and I think you will see the United States pushing quite a few other countries as well. And there will, and hopefully we can get into that everyone's pushing each other to get better cycle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. When I look a bit at the chat, so there are a couple of questions, and I think they also deserve an answer, at least on what you think of it, because there are quite some questions that are a bit more related to, well, the fundamental problems we see in Washington, basically. So it's the link between politicians and fossil fuel industry. But also another question is about how the democracy is working / non-working in the United States, which of course at the moment is very much biased towards the Republicans. If you look, for example, in the Senate, of course, each state is having 2 representatives, which means that a state like Alabama is having as many senators as California. But I also think it's for the electoral vote in the system of the presidential elections. So maybe just to hear from you on these more fundamental issues that we're having. So this relation of politicians with the fossil fuel industry and how the democracy is working in the United States. How do you see that possibility to change that in the coming years? Because for that, you need a bit more than 4 years, isn't it?
I don't think it's that you need more time. I think it's that you need to have won over more people. We have this third of the country that isn't with us, and it's only a third of the country, but there was they're given a lot of power in the Constitution. This third of the country, as you said, empty land has a lot of power in this country, where even whether or not there's a human being on that land, and so what you see is that we have a Constitution that was frankly built so that white male people who owned other human beings and other land were maximizing their power in the system that was set up. and it was brutal towards anyone else. And that system, changing it is something that takes more than even 50 votes. And so the system is set up so you really need a supermajority to make massive changes. On top of that, I would say that most of the state legislatures in this country are captured by fossil fuel interests in the utilities. And that is, campaigns that have to be run state by state to get that money out of the state legislatures. And those state legislatures become very important because they decide the outlines of the voting units for Congress, and the gerrymandering of so that you choose the size of and location of your voters. And so it really needs to be the other way around. Voters need to pick politicians. Politicians shouldn't be picking their voters. And right now, politicians are choosing who their voters are instead of voters choosing who their politicians are. And there's a lot of democracy reform needed in this country. I think some of it we can get done, but some of it we don't have enough votes to get done. Things like removing the Electoral College, removing the filibuster. We just had a census this year in this country that decides a lot of things. It was highly, highly compromised by the Trump administration, the way that it was conducted, on top of being compromised by COVID. This is where we count how many people are in each place, and it's really important because it says how many people get to vote in each place. And so I don't want to paint a rosy picture here about the state of our democracy in the United States. It is not pretty. This is a huge level of effort that will be needed in order to fix it. And I think I hope it is at least can serve as a warning to folks around the world about how quickly fascism can take hold if we are not very, very careful to pay attention to our democratic processes. And again, this is not just happening in the US. We see the rise of fascism happening and autocracy happening and nationalism happening in Hungary, in the Philippines, in Brazil, in India. Unfortunately, I can go on and on with that list, but it is a very dangerous thing to have decades of neoliberalism where people are hurting combined with compromised democratic systems. And I hope that as a global community we can pay attention to that a little bit more and the dangers of it.
No, absolutely. And as one of the viewers is rightfully pointing out, that at least a better gender balance already in the appointees that we now see arising from Joe Biden when he's forming in his administration, at least promises to be better, at least, because also this lack of gender balance, like you said, it has been white male dominated for a very long while. So hopefully that's indeed, well, at least that seems to be changing already under Joe Biden, carefully, but there is some shift going on there. Maybe just to conclude on the final, because that's another person, a viewer, asking that in the chat, and that's maybe a clear how the Europeans are watching the American debates, which is unfolding during any elections. It's always this kind of scaremongering that anything that you are also talking about, and where Joe Biden is talking about in a much more careful way, but already in that moment in time, he's being blamed to be a socialist, or even worse, a communist, right? It's in the United States probably the worst to say to someone. Yeah. And surprisingly, it is working. People are getting scared of that. You saw it in Florida, for example, where probably just the fear of having a communist did scare off quite some people to vote. And again, Florida went to Trump. So how do we change that narrative? What is the fear? I know the communism, but from a European perspective, if we hear Joe Biden, we don't hear a communist. We hear a moderate conservative, I would say. Yeah. But in the US, he's a communist. And how do we change that?
I mean, look, this is whatever the Democratic Party is going to do is going to be called communist and socialist. And I think that the danger is that the administration starts to feel like, oh, I don't want to be called a socialist. Like, well, you're going to be called a socialist literally whatever you do. So why don't you instead just deal with how do we actually help people? do things that help people, and then people will be helped, and we will have a tangible, good outcome. I think we need to stop worrying about these words and these labels, because it just, at the end of the day, it just paralyzes people, and it doesn't even make any sense. Whatever words we use will be attacked. And that comes down to the breakdown of society, and the fact that we're living in different information bubbles, and the fact that we don't have any common reality even that we can tap into. Like, my lived reality is so different from a Trump voter's lived reality that I don't have any. First of all, I don't even know any of them, if that gives you some point of reference. Like, but I don't have any, basis on which to have a conversation. Whereas what we have, I mean, honestly, most white people in this country do know Trump voters, but they also find they have no common reality with which to talk to them. And so you have to then start with like really personal stories and personal values and break through that way. And so it's a long-term project, but for me, the problem isn't, that people are screaming socialism. The problem is that they're completely operating from a fact base that is not real. Like, one of Trump's advisors, Kellyanne Conway, by the way, he actually had a lot of scary women too. So I don't know that only having
That's
women,
true. Yeah.
but Kellyanne Conway say, well, they have their facts, we have our facts, and it's like, that's not how facts work. But that has become what's happening, through the abuse of social media platforms. And that's also something that I think could be done that would really improve our democracy, is the regulation of these social media platforms, because that's where a lot of these bubbles of reality live. And if we want people to get out of that and actually understand, like, look, we do have a climate crisis, we do have a COVID crisis. Like, it doesn't actually help for you to scream not to wear masks any more than it helps for you to scream that we can't get off of fossil fuels. Like, we have to have some like basis of conversation reality. So we've got to regulate those social media platforms. We've got to have conversations. It's a long road ahead. We are just at the beginning. Again, like, we just got to the part where we got the plans to the Death Star. We have a very long road ahead in this country.
Well, thanks a lot for that. Looking at the time, it's already, we have done this now for an hour. I think we could have been talking much longer, but let's also keep our viewers a bit fascinated like that. So I really would like to thank you, and certainly also for broadening up that discussion, because we all know we had 4 dire years under Trump, and you even more than we. And so everyone is looking forward, at least now, I cannot say everyone, but a large majority, certainly in the European Union, is looking forward to a new president-elect and a regained effort on climate action. But as you rightfully point out, a lot needs to happen still. And there is a massive and a very profound agenda that needs to be addressed in the coming years. So I think for you, that means you will have 4 very, very busy years, and hopefully very successful years as well. And that if we talk to each other in 4 years' time, we can at least see the beginning of a fundamental change and shift in our society, which we need in the United States, as we need it also at the European side. And I'm looking forward to start that travel, as you say, next year. And it's going to be a long travel, but I'm looking forward, and with your energy and spirit, I'm sure we can push it further than what we expect now. So thank you very much, and really looking forward, and really great that you took the time to talk to us. And as said, hopefully we will soon each other somewhere, maybe next year in Glasgow, on a very successful climate summit. And I hope we can have some good messages from the US then there as well.
Absolutely. We will work on it. Thank you so much for having me.
You're very much welcome, and great work, and keep up the great work, and see you very soon, Keya. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye-bye.